Hello everyone, this is Delster and welcome to another video for Dark Side of the Ring, and in this episode review it talks about the life of Chris Colt. I heard that Chris Colt had a crazy gimmick, and from the pictures that I saw on Google, he looks kinda scary. I will learn more about him while watching this episode. From the title of this episode, it might be intense since it says Welcome to My Nightmare, which I don't know if this is based on the Alice Cooper song. I used to work at Halloween City, and they would play that song every day, which is a pretty good song, especially during the Halloween season. Before we get to Chris's upbringing, we get an insight to Chris's journal that his great nephew Ty found. In it, we can hear the words that Chris wrote about his entire life, and supposedly Chris wanted to publish it. Chris was born Charles Fay Harris in Orofino, Idaho, but was raised in Drain, Oregon. His birthday was June 22nd, 1946. As a child, his family would drink a lot, and they would have brawls while the kids were around. When Chris was 10, he came home and his entire house on the inside was destroyed. His mom's face was covered in blood due to Chris's grandfather hitting her with a gun. Chris thought that she was dead, but he hid his mom in a car as the grandfather was coming towards Chris and his mom. Chris's sister starts the car as the grandfather approaches, and Chris tells him that he wished that he was dead. His grandfather hits Chris and breaks Chris's eardrum. The grandfather brings out another gun and shoots at the car, but Chris, his mom, and his sister were able to escape and drive away from the house. In Rosenberg, Chris was inspired by the wrestling shows that he saw there that he himself wanted to be a professional wrestler. While he was in school, the class was asked what they wanted to be when they grew up, and Chris said that he wanted to be a professional wrestler. The class laughed at him, and in his journal he said that it hurt his feelings. Once he got to high school, Chris made it in the wrestling team and bleached his hair blonde in order to stand out. I think he got kicked out of the wrestling team because he bleached his hair. Chris had rocks thrown at him afterwards and decided from there that he wanted to prove his classmates that he could be a wrestler. He went to a wrestling school in Chicago but was denied because he did not have an invitation. When he met a kid who was doing prostitution, Chris decided to also do it so that he could save money in order to go to a wrestling school. In his diary, Chris said that he was always more attracted to men than women as he was hitting the streets and getting money. Chris had a variety of wrestling names until he chose the name Chris Colt because of a magazine that he saw called Colt Magazine. One of Chris's friends named Tom told him that they would be drafted for the Vietnam War, but Chris said that he would not get drafted because Chris liked boys. Victoria, whose wrestling name was Princess Victoria, was told to spend time with Chris in order for him to get attracted to girls, but it didn't work. At the same time, she was in Mula's training school, and there were rumors that Mula had used her trainees in order for them to sleep with men. So a promoter probably wanted Chris to sleep with a woman in order to make him straight. Wrestling in the 50s and 60s was difficult for people to be gay and lesbian as there was a lot of homophobia. In any wrestling territory, Chris would be in and out of them because he had personal issues with the men in the locker room. However, Chris did stay in Arizona territory a lot longer. Chris becomes tag team partners with a man named Ron Dupree and takes the name Paul Dupree, as they were brothers but in the wrestling storyline. Chris and Ron became very close and soon became a couple. The team was known as Hell's Angels, and Chris at that point started to push the boundaries of wrestling. There was one incident where Chris took it way too far. In 1968, Chris burned an American flag in order to push boundaries and get heat over the fans. However, the wrestling program was taken off television after this incident, and Chris got fired. Chris was not anti-American, but he was someone who had a lot of surprise stories. In one of the stories that he wrote in his journal, Chris wanted to go to San Francisco as it was liberating in the 60s and open. He goes to a marketplace and sees a woman sitting alone. They end up hanging out, and Chris wrote in his journal that the woman seemed really sad, pain, and hurt from the look of her eyes. As they were walking, he saw a poster of the woman that he was talking to, and that woman was Janis Joplin. Chris told her why she didn't tell him that Janis was this famous singer, and Janis said that she just wanted a friend. He told Janis that Chris will always be her friend. Around that time, Chris was a roadie for Joe Cocker and worked with Janis or got high with her. He would dress as a male Janis when in the wrestling circuit. with the jewelry and chains and clothes. Chris had an obsession with death and wore black makeup around his eyes as he called himself a psychopath. Jim Cornette calls Ozzy Osbourne Mother Teresa when comparing him to Chris. The fans thought that Chris was like a rock star because of his gimmick. When he was wrestling in a steel cage, Chris had taken LSD before the match and imagined that there were spiders in the ring. Chris climbs over the cage and punches the fans. The audience pummeled and threw bottles at him, but he was able to take them on until the police finally came. One of his tag team partners, named Bill, was trying to help Chris, and the whole scene turns into a riot. Things got difficult for Chris, as his partner Ron goes through a heart attack and can't wrestle anymore. Chris joins Bill and a guy named Mike Boyette as Chris and Mike wrestled as a tag team, while Bill was a valet and was called Bill Colt. While wrestling, Chris changed into different outfits, but the team eventually ended up in disaster, as one day it all went downhill when the trio were in a car and Chris was in the back seat getting high. Out of nowhere, Chris punches Bill and grabs Mike's hair and then tries to grab Bill's hair. Mike was not happy about the situation. He was a Vietnam veteran and a judo champion, so he was a very strong guy not to mess with. Chris gets out of the car and punches each of his tag team partners in the face. Mike gets out of the car and has Chris into a face lock until Chris goes limp and drops him on the ground. He then goes back to the car, takes the wheel from Bill, and tries to run over Chris as he wanted to kill him. Bill takes the wheel in order to prevent Mike from running over Chris. While being interviewed, Bill realized that he could have gone to jail with Mike for murder had Mike got away with it. Back to the episode, they leave Chris for dead until the next day. Bill sees Chris at the dining table with a smile on his face. Chris tells Bill that they were leaving Mike. When they got off from an air flight, Chris had already hit the bar, thus causing Bill to walk away from Chris. Bill said in this episode that Chris told him that he had plans to die at 27 in order to join the 27 Club and Janice. Unfortunately, Chris's partner Ron had another heart attack in Tacoma, Washington in 1995 where he was doing ring announcing work. Chris rode in the ambulance with Ron but unfortunately died on the way to the hospital. In Ron's deathbed, Chris held Ron's hand and cried. He had been with Ron for 6 years and was devastated by his death. After Ron's death, Chris changed his wrestling name to the Chris Colt Experience while using Alice Cooper's song, Welcome to My Nightmare, making it the first time a wrestler has used modern music for their entrance music. A wrestler named Edward said that Chris got banned on television from England as people there thought that he was very bizarre. Chris's drug addiction had worsened at this point and was hardly showing up to the wrestling shows. His shock value was more shocking when he used a Nazi gimmick in Alabama. Many wrestlers used that gimmick in the 50s and 60s in order to get more heat or hate from the audience. One of them being Fritz von Erich as well. The drugs that Chris did at the time were cocaine and crystal meth. Once the 80s happened, Chris stopped wrestling and switched to drugs. Chris got busted in a house full of drugs but managed to get away from the place. One wrestler saw Chris in an adult movie. Rhonda, Chris's niece, said that she heard Chris had died in Seattle at a back alley. She is the daughter of Chris's sister and would call Chris Uncle Chuck. Tom heard that Chris was found in a chair with a needle in his arm and that he had been dead for 2 to 3 days. Jack heard that Chris died of AIDS in a flop house in Seattle, Washington. Ty heard that Chris's death was not peaceful. Chris's death certificate showed that he died of HIV, but no autopsy was performed. At the end of this episode, we see Bill showing us Chris's grave. Bill says that he wished Chris was here. Jim and Jack said that Chris was ahead of his time. Supposedly, Chris was the first wrestler to create the move where he came off the top rope with the elbow hitting the mat. Victoria said that if Chris had not used drugs, he would have been one of the greatest wrestlers. Rhonda said that Chris would bring something when he visited his nieces and nephews. Interviewers for this episode are Jim Cornette, Bill Anderson, Ty Haggard, Chris's great-nephew, Rhonda Rondeau, niece of Chris, Tom Burke, wrestling collector and historian, Victoria Otis, Princess Victoria, Edward Giovanetti, Moondog Moretti, and Jack Fritzer, director and social activist. This episode was very interesting but kind of sad or tragic. I give it a 10 out of 10 as it gives out a lot more information than what I saw on Wikipedia and other sites. Even Chris's journals seem to have a lot more to say. Had they reopened Chris's case on how he died, I think it would have some closure to his biography. I felt so bad that his classmates would make fun of him because he wanted to be a wrestler. Nowadays, a lot of people want to be wrestlers or have started watching wrestling more than ever. Chris was a lucky guy as he got to be friends with Janice, who happens to be one of my favorite singers actually. I'm glad he was able to prove his classmates wrong as he became a wrestler with charisma and shock value. It must have been really hard for him to be out and gay because a lot of people during the 1900s were most likely homophobic. I agree with Victoria, had Chris not taken drugs, he probably would have gone far in the wrestling business. He kind of reminds me a little of Bray Wyatt with all the makeup and jewelry and the antics. I think if Chris was still alive, he probably might be happy or feel accepted since there's more wrestlers who are LGBTQIA plus as of now. Maybe that's why he did drugs. He probably had some guilt. Overall, it was a really good episode with such a sad ending. I hope people continue to remember Chris and that his journal gets published someday. Some of that stuff in the journal was very interesting and it made the episode really stand out. Anyway, this is Delster and I'll see you guys in the next video. Comment, like, subscribe if you want to, and I'll see you guys in the next video. And take care of your mental health and everyone around you. And until next time, bye guys.